The chrysanthemums were in bloom on February 20th, 1942. Shimoda stood in the second greenhouse at 5:45 in the morning, the way he had stood every morning for 11 years, holding a clay pot in one hand and a water wand in the other. The chrysanthemums were white and gold, and a deep bruised purple. They smelled of green and wet earth, and something faintly sweet that he had never been able to name, but that he associated entirely with his father's hands. They were ready to sell. He had 40 flats ready for the San Jose market, and another 60 in early bloom, and a full growing season ahead of him in the 100-acre light of the California Valley. He set down the water wand. The previous afternoon, a notice had appeared on a telephone pole 3 blocks from his house. He had read it twice, standing on the sidewalk in the February wind. He had read it a third time at the kitchen table after dinner, while Fumiko washed the dishes and George did his homework, and his father sat in the front room, with the radio turned low. The notice was printed in English on white paper, and it bore the seal of the United States government, and it informed all persons of Japanese ancestry living in Military Area No. 1, which was the Western Defense Command's designation for, essentially, everything west of the Cascade and Sierra Nevada ranges, that they would be required to report for evacuation. The word used was evacuation. The word meant removal. The word meant prison. He was 35 years old. He had been born in San Jose. He had graduated from San Jose State College with a degree in agricultural science. He had voted in every presidential election since 1928, the first one he was old enough to enter. He had paid federal taxes and state taxes and local property taxes without exception. He had a Social Security number. He had a driver's license. He had a mortgage, half paid. He had a son in high school who played baseball and wanted to be an engineer. He had a wife who had taught 3rd grade at Horace Mann Elementary School for 4 years before the school district quietly let her go, in the months after Pearl Harbor, without giving a reason. He had never been to Japan. His Japanese consisted of the words his father used at the dinner table and the words written on the wooden signs his father had kept above the greenhouse doors, which he had always meant to learn to read and had always been meaning to get around to, and now would not. None of it mattered. What mattered was his face. The executive order had been signed the day before by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man who had spent a lifetime being called a friend to the American worker, the architect of the New Deal, the champion of the common man. The order was called Executive Order 9066. It did not mention Japanese Americans by name. It authorized the Secretary of War to designate military areas from which any or all persons might be excluded at the Secretary's discretion. It was 4 paragraphs long. It was written in the careful, hedged language of bureaucracy, which is the language of doing something terrible while preserving the ability to say later that the language never specified exactly what you meant. The word Japanese did not appear. The effect was total. Shimoda put down the clay pot beside the chrysanthemums his father had spent 30 years learning how to grow. He walked to the end of the greenhouse and stood in the doorway, looking at the dark fields and the first gray light coming up over the coastal range. He was trying to decide whether to feel afraid or angry, and he could not feel either one yet. What he felt was the specific, nauseating clarity of a man who has read a document and understood it perfectly, and is waiting for some part of his mind to find the error, the loophole, the exception that will make the document not mean what it clearly means. There was no error. There was no loophole. There was no exception. He was an American. The government did not care. He went inside to make coffee and to tell his father. Isamu Shimoda had come to California in 1908 at the age of 34, which meant he had been in this country for 34 years, exactly as long as the life he had left in Japan. He had left Hiroshima Prefecture with $40, an introduction letter to a cousin in Fresno, and the kind of intention that men carry across oceans when they believe the crossing can be made profitable by will. He had worked in the Fresno fields for 3 years, strawberries, cotton, asparagus, in the killing San Joaquin heat. And then he had moved north to San Jose and rented a quarter-acre plot and grown vegetables. And then he had rented more land. And then, in 1919, he had saved enough to lease 10 acres in the Coyote Valley south of the city, and he had put up his first greenhouse. The nursery had taken its current shape over 20 years of incremental expansion. 4 greenhouses now, a potting shed, a cold storage room, a propagation bench that Isamu had built himself from scrap lumber, a small house at the edge of the property where the family lived, and 10 acres of field crops running to chrysanthemums, carnations, and the sweet William that Fumiko had introduced 4 years ago and that had become their best retail seller. The equipment alone, the boilers for the greenhouses, the flatbed truck, the irrigation system, the potting machines, was worth more than $12,000. The land lease had 17 years remaining. The standing inventory at current market prices was worth over $8,000. The business as a going concern, with its established buyers and delivery routes and reputation in the San Jose wholesale market, was worth considerably more than either of those figures in isolation. The total, if Tok calculated it honestly, and he was his father's son, which meant he calculated everything honestly, was somewhere between $35,000 and $45,000. He had 10 days to sell it. This is the pure arithmetic of dispossession. 30 years to build, 10 days to sell, $40,000 to lose. The math takes 1 sentence. The life it destroyed took 3 decades to assemble, and it was assembled by a man who could not become an American citizen. The law forbade it, and who had nonetheless built something here that was more American than most Americans would ever touch. A thing made from land and labor and time, a thing that fed other people, a thing that employed 4 men besides himself, a thing with a sign out front that said, Shimoda Nursery, established 1919 in the hand of the man who built it, who would die in 1959, having never been permitted by law to become a citizen of the country he built it in. Isamu sat at the kitchen table on the morning of February 20th and listened to his son explain what the notice on the telephone pole said, and he did not speak for a long time. He was 68 years old. He had the hands of a man who had worked in greenhouses for 40 years, which is to say his hands looked like maps of a country with many rivers. He drank his coffee and looked at the wall above the stove where Fumiko had hung a calendar with pictures of California wildflowers, and he said finally, in Japanese, something that Tok translated for George as, "We knew this was possible." George, who was 16, and had the particular fury of a 16-year-old who has just encountered the first real injustice of his life, said, "We knew this was possible, and we just stayed." Isamu looked at his grandson for a moment. He said, and Tok translated this more slowly, that a man does not abandon the thing he has built because someone might someday take it from him. He said that if they had operated from fear of what might happen, they would never have built anything. He said that the 30 years were not wasted simply because they were ending. He said this without apparent bitterness, which was either the wisdom of an old man or the practiced suppression of a man who had learned long ago that anger cost more than he could afford. Then he asked for more coffee. Fumiko Shimoda, 32 years old, former 3rd-grade teacher, keeper of a journal she had been writing since 1934, a woman who read 3 library books a week and could conjugate irregular French verbs from a textbook she had bought at a second-hand shop and studied by lamplight for reasons she had never entirely explained, poured the coffee, and then went to stand at the kitchen window looking at the greenhouses. She did not say anything. She was constructing, in her mind, the list of things she could carry. She was a woman of significant organizational capacity, which is to say that she responded to catastrophe by making lists. She was already understanding that the list would be shorter than the life, and that the distance between the two represented a loss she had no existing category for. She would find the category later. It would take years. The notice on the telephone pole was Public Proclamation No. 1, issued by Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, Commanding General of the Western Defense Command, 4th Army. DeWitt was 61 years old, a career Army officer who had spent most of his career in the Philippines and in administrative posts, and who had been appointed to head the Western Defense Command in December 1941, 3 days before Pearl Harbor. He was not an unreasonable man by the standards of his time, which is a sentence that should give you pause, because the standards of his time produced the following statement, which DeWitt included in his formal recommendation to the Secretary of War in February 1942. The Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second and third generation Japanese born on United States soil, possessed of United States citizenship, have become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted. Read that sentence slowly. A general of the United States Army, a democracy, a constitutional republic, submitted this as the official reasoning for removing 120,000 people from their homes. Not their behavior, their race, their racial strains, the word undiluted. As if American citizenship were a dilutant. As if being born in California to parents who had worked California soil for 30 years was insufficient to overcome the contamination of Japanese blood. But DeWitt was not finished. He also argued, in the same recommendation, that the absence of any sabotage or espionage by Japanese Americans since Pearl Harbor was itself suspicious. He wrote, "The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken." This is the argument. Read it again. The evidence that Japanese Americans were dangerous was that they hadn't been dangerous. 0 incidents of sabotage proved that sabotage was imminent. Their innocence was proof of their guilt. If a student submitted this as logic homework, the student would fail. The United States government submitted it as military policy, and 120,000 people went to camps. It is worth noting, and this is worth noting carefully, that J. Edgar Hoover opposed mass internment. J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, the man who built his career on surveilling Americans with an enthusiasm that made constitutional scholars reach for aspirin, the man who kept files on sitting presidents and members of Congress, the man whose idea of civil liberties was flexible to the point of non-existence, that man looked at DeWitt's recommendation and said it was unnecessary. The FBI believed that targeted surveillance of known suspects was sufficient, that there was no intelligence justification for mass removal, and that the Army's proposal was extreme. When the FBI is the voice of reason in the room, you have achieved something remarkable. You have built a position to the civil liberties left of J. Edgar Hoover. You have done this by proposing to imprison 120,000 people based on their faces. DeWitt did it anyway. FDR signed it. The notice gave Tak Shimoda 10 days. He spent the first 2 days in a state that was neither grief nor anger, but something more like the focused dissociation of a man who understands he must work very fast, or lose even more than he is already going to lose. He called the nursery's wholesale buyers and told them he was selling. He called the equipment dealer in Salinas and asked for an appraisal. He called the county assessor's office and asked about his lease. He drove to the bank and asked about the mortgage and was told that the balance due, $11,000, was not waivable, and that his payments would continue to come due whether he was present or not. He drove home and sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. By the 3rd day, word had spread in the Japanese-American community that people were selling. The buyers were not Japanese. The buyers were white neighbors and speculators, and men in good suits who drove down from San Francisco with briefcases and made offers that were not offers in any honest sense of the word, but were simply statements of what they were willing to give, knowing the seller had no alternative. A man named Richards offered Tak $500 for the entire operation. Tak said the inventory alone was worth $8,000. Richards said he understood that. He said he was offering $500. Tak asked what he was supposed to do if he didn't sell. Richards said he supposed the property would sit empty, and the lease would continue accruing, and the bank would eventually foreclose, and that seemed like a worse outcome. Tak agreed that it was a worse outcome. He signed the paper. It is not accurate to say that Richards was a villain. He was a businessman applying the logic of the market to a situation the government had engineered. He had not signed Executive Order 9066. He had not written DeWitt's recommendation. He had simply arrived at the point of maximum leverage and applied it. His arithmetic was impeccable. His conscience is not the subject of this story. The subject of this story is what $500 is, measured against 30 years. It is almost nothing. It is the price of a used car in 1942. It is approximately 1 week's revenue at the nursery's average sales. It is 1/80th of the value of what it purchased. It represents the material total of Isamu Shimoda's 30 years in California, which is to say that 30 years of a man's working life, the greenhouses and the fields and the cold storage room and the propagation bench and the established roots and the reputation and the 17 years remaining on the lease and the possibility of all the future years, was worth, on February 26, 1942, in the market the government had created, $500. The math of dispossession takes one sentence. The life it destroyed took 30 years to build. Tak gave the signed paper to Richards and took the $500 in cash and drove home. Isamu was in the second greenhouse watering the chrysanthemums. He did not look up when Tak came in. Tak stood watching his father water the chrysanthemums for a moment, and then he said, "I sold it." Isamu kept watering. He said, "For how much?" Tak told him. Isamu moved the water wand to the next flat. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in Japanese, "Your grandfather started a rice farm in Hiroshima when he was 20 years old. He died with nothing. I started again. You will start again." Tak was not sure he believed this, but he did not say so. He went inside to help Fumiko pack. The packing was the second education in what was real. Fumiko had made her list. The list was 3 pages long, and she had gone through it twice, marking items with codes she had devised. E for essential, U for useful, H for sentimental. When she tallied the E and U columns and converted them to weight and volume, they exceeded by a significant margin the amount 2 adults, a 16-year-old and a 68-year-old man, could carry. She went through the list again. The piano was not on the list. The piano was a 1927 upright Steinway that her parents had bought for $60 when she was 8 years old, and that had come with her from Sacramento when she married Tak in 1934, transported in a borrowed truck with 2 quilts wrapped around it. She had played it every week of her life since she was 8 years old. She had taught George to play on it. She had given lessons to the neighborhood children on it, $2 a month, for 3 years until Pearl Harbor made the neighborhood children's parents uncertain about piano lessons from a Japanese woman. She had played it 2 nights ago, on February 18th, the night before the executive order, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, which was the piece she played when she was afraid and needed something her hands knew without thinking. She put a handmade sign on it. Free to good home. Piano in working condition. No one came. She left it. She left the piano, and the second sofa, and the bedroom furniture except for what she could fold into a trunk, and the kitchen equipment except for 2 pots, and the good knife, and the framed pictures except for the photographs, and the books except for 5. She allowed herself 5, and the garden tools and the yard furniture, and the curtains she had sewn herself from fabric she had bought at the dry goods store on First Street, and the jars of preserved plums on the pantry shelf that she had put up in September, and that she had been looking forward to eating in February. And February was now, but she would not be here. The dog, a 10-year-old beagle mix named Biscuit, who had been George's since he was 6, she gave to the Hendricks family across the road. Margaret Hendricks took the dog without quite meeting Fumiko's eyes, and said she would take good care of him, and Fumiko believed she meant it. George held the dog for a long time in the driveway, and then handed him to the Hendricks daughter without speaking, and walked back into the house. He did not come out again that evening. On the day they left, each person was given a tag. The tag was white paper with a string attached, printed with a family number, and you were required to tie it to yourself, to your coat or your shirt or your bag, so that you could be identified at the assembly center. The Shimoda family's number was 27841. Tak tied his tag to his coat. Fumiko tied hers to her bag. George tied his to his jacket with a set jaw, and the expression of a boy learning something he will carry for the rest of his life. Isamu held his tag in his hand for a moment, looking at it, and then tied it to the button of his coat with hands that did not entirely keep steady. "What is your name?" The government's answer was 27841. The Santa Anita Assembly Center had been, before the war, a famous horse racing track in Arcadia, California. Before the Army converted it, it had hosted some of the finest quarter horses on the West Coast. The smell, particular and penetrating and organic, had saturated the wood of the stalls to a depth that no amount of cleaning would reach. They cleaned it anyway. They put up partitions and nailed plywood over the lower walls and spread straw on the floor and called the result family housing. Fumiko set her suitcase down in the stall and looked at the wall and looked at the partition and looked at the window, a small square of light, high up, and looked at the floor. The smell of horses was everywhere. It was not a bad smell in the outdoors, in the context of horses, which is where it belonged. In this context, it was the smell of the government's opinion of what she was worth. She did not write in her journal that night. She sat on the cot and listened to the sounds of 4,000 people settling into spaces not designed for human habitation, and she held the 5 books she had chosen: a French grammar, 2 novels, George's birth certificate in the back of a collection of Whitman's poetry, and a Japanese botanical dictionary that had been her father-in-law's, and that she had taken on an instinct she could not have explained. And she held them in her lap and looked at the ceiling. She was a former school teacher. She was an American. She was in a horse stall. She was inside the horse stall because General DeWitt believed the absence of evidence was evidence. She was in a horse stall because the President of the United States had signed a paper. She was in a horse stall because 80 years of legal exclusion, the laws that had prevented Isamu from becoming a citizen, the laws that had prevented Japanese immigrants from owning land, the laws that had enshrined their foreignness in statute, had built a structure in which it was possible to imprison 120,000 people without any of them having done anything wrong. And the structure held because it was made of law, and the law was made of paper, and the paper was made of language, and the language was the language of democracy, and democracy was supposed to protect her. Suppose it again. She was an American. She was in a horse stall. She would write about it in the morning. Tonight she sat and held her books and waited for it to become tomorrow. The permanent camp was at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. The buses arrived in September 1942, after several months at Santa Anita, during which Fumiko had organized a school for the younger children, using 2 borrowed blackboards and the French grammar, and a donated copy of an arithmetic textbook from 1931. And George had played baseball in the Assembly Center's infield with a bat someone had brought in a suitcase, and Isamu had found a plot of bare dirt near the fence line, and begun, with methodical intent, to grow chrysanthemums in it, which they were not technically allowed to do, but which no one stopped him from doing. Hart Mountain was in northwestern Wyoming, north of Cody, in the shadow of a butte that gave the camp its name. The mountain was genuinely beautiful in the way that remote Wyoming geology is beautiful, which is to say it was large and indifferent, and did not care at all who was looking at it. The camp was not beautiful. The camp was 468 acres of tar paper barracks arranged in blocks on a high sage flat at an elevation of nearly 5,000 feet, which meant winter temperatures that dropped to -30, and a wind that came in under the barracks doors because the construction was fast and the insulation was non-existent. The barracks were 20 feet wide and 120 feet long and divided into units of varying size, and the Shimodas were assigned to a unit that was 20 feet by 20 feet, which is the size of a generous parking space or a modest horse stall, and which was expected to house 4 people for the duration of the war. There was a central mess hall for each block. The food was institutional: canned vegetables, Vienna sausages, rice, occasional fresh vegetables when the supply chain cooperated. There were communal latrines with no partitions between the toilets. There were communal washrooms. There was a hospital with insufficient staff. There was a school for the children. There was a post office. There was a small newspaper called the Hart Mountain Sentinel, run by internees, that navigated with considerable skill the difficult problem of reporting honestly on a situation in which the reporters were also the prisoners. There were churches. There were baseball fields. There were block councils that administered daily life. There were, behind all of it, guard towers at the corners of the fence line, manned by armed soldiers whose weapons pointed inward. The weapons pointed inward. This is the architectural detail that clarifies the government's intentions without any need for interpretation. A guard tower whose weapons point outward is protecting the people inside from threats outside. A guard tower whose weapons point inward is keeping the people inside from leaving. The Army's official language described the camps as war relocation authority centers and used words like evacuee and relocate and center. The weapons pointed inward. Lieutenant Cal Sheehan arrived at Hart Mountain in December 1942 as the camp's assistant administrative officer. He was 33 years old, a Yale graduate who had been working in the legal department of a Hartford insurance company before his commission. And he was not a bad man. He was careful, diligent, not unkind, possessed of a bureaucratic competence that the Army found valuable in a camp that needed to function administratively on a day-to-day basis, which meant processing arrivals and managing records and administering the regulations that governed what internees could and could not do, which was a long list, and distributing the forms that needed to be filled out, which was a longer list, and maintaining the files of 10,767 people who were living behind barbed wire, and who were not criminals, and who had not been charged with anything, and who had no hearing date, and who had no recourse in law, and who were required to stay. He processed their arrival forms. He issued their barrack assignments. He managed the supply requisitions and the mail and the visitor request protocols, and the employment records of the internees who were permitted to work outside the camp in nearby farms because Wyoming needed labor and the Army permitted it, which raises a question we will return to later. He did his job. He was not cruel. He was not visibly troubled by what he was doing. He was administratively efficient in a situation that was, if you looked at it from the outside, a profound institutional atrocity, and his efficiency was the institution's condition of possibility. And this is the thing about institutions. They require people like Lieutenant Sheehan, reasonable men who do their jobs, and without those people they cannot function, and with those people they can do almost anything. He did his job. The institution functioned. In February 1943, the War Relocation Authority issued a form. The form was called the War Relocation Authority Application for Leave Clearance, but it quickly became known by a different name, which was the Loyalty Questionnaire. It was administered to all internees over the age of 17. The form had 28 questions. Questions 27 and 28 were the ones that mattered. Question 27. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty, wherever ordered? This question was asked of everyone over 17, including women in their 60s, including men in their 80s, including Isamu Shimoda, who was 69 years old, and who had been growing chrysanthemums in Wyoming since October, with the permission of a lieutenant he had never spoken to, who had issued a form allowing him to cultivate a small plot behind Barrack 17. Question 28. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor, to any other foreign government, power, or organization? For an American citizen, for Tak, for Fumiko, for George, this question was a loyalty oath. Uncomfortable, insulting in its premise, but answerable. You say yes. You swear allegiance to the country you were already loyal to. You answer a question that asked you to prove something you had never unproven. For Isamu Shimoda, the question was a trap. Isamu was an Issei, first generation, born in Japan, resident of the United States for 34 years, resident who was legally prevented from becoming a naturalized American citizen, because the Naturalization Act of 1790, as modified by subsequent legislation, restricted naturalization to white persons and persons of African descent, excluding virtually everyone of Asian origin. Isamu Shimoda was Japanese. He could not become American. He had lived in America for 34 years. He could not become American. He had built a nursery in California and paid his taxes for 34 years. He could not become American. He was the father of an American citizen and the grandfather of an American citizen. He could not become American. This was not an oversight. It was policy. For 34 years he had been here on the government's terms, resident alien, permitted to stay, not permitted to belong. Now the government asked him to forswear allegiance to the Japanese emperor. If he said yes, if he forswore, he would be renouncing his Japanese citizenship, which was his only citizenship, the only national belonging he had in law, because the United States had never permitted him another. He would be declaring himself a citizen of nowhere, stateless. A man with no country at 69 years old, living behind barbed wire in Wyoming, having sold his nursery for $500. If he said no, if he refused to forswear allegiance to a Japanese emperor he did not personally give a particular damn about, but whose citizenship was all he had, he would be classified as disloyal. He would be segregated to the high-security camp at Tule Lake in California, designated dangerous, and potentially deported after the war, to a Japan he had left at 34, and that he had not been back to in 35 years. He could answer yes and be stateless. He could answer no and be deported. The government called this a loyalty questionnaire. There is a word for a question that is designed so that every answer is wrong. The word is not questionnaire, but the government called it a questionnaire and administered it to 69-year-old men who were growing chrysanthemums in Wyoming and who had been American in every practical sense for 34 years, and who were being asked to prove their loyalty by choosing between statelessness and deportation. Isamu sat with the form at the table in their 20 by 20-foot unit at Hart Mountain for 3 days. He asked Tak to explain the question again. Tak explained it. Isamu sat with it. On the 3rd day, he answered yes to question 27. He was 69 years old, but he answered yes, he would serve if called. And he answered yes to question 28, forswearing allegiance to the Japanese emperor. He signed the form. He handed it to Tak to submit. Tak asked him if he was sure. Isamu said, "What choice is there? There were other men who refused. The No-No boys, Men who answered no to both questions, or who qualified their answers, or who wrote protests in the margins, were segregated to Tule Lake. Some had answered no because they were angry, because they refused to swear allegiance to a government that had imprisoned them without charge, because the oath felt like a second insult after the first insult of the wire. Some had answered no because they were Issei in Isamu's situation and had made the other calculation. Some had answered no because they wanted to be deported, because Japan had not locked them up, because America had, and the math of belonging pointed in a direction it had not pointed before. Many of the no-no boys had never been to Japan. Some were deported there after the war, to a country they did not know, speaking a language they had learned from their parents but had never lived in, with nowhere to go, and no one who knew them. The government, which had imprisoned them for being Japanese, then deported them for being insufficiently American. The circularity of this is the circularity of persecution. You are guilty if you belong, and guilty if you don't, and the crime is always the same crime, which is existing. George answered, yes, yes. He did this with dispatch and without internal conflict, which was not because the conflict was not there, but because he had been processing it since February, and had reached the clarity that sometimes follows prolonged, focused anger. He was 17 now. He was in a camp. He was going to get out. He volunteered for the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in January 1944. The 442nd was an Army unit formed specifically from Japanese-American volunteers, Nisei men who had answered yes, yes, and who were willing to fight for the United States, which is a sentence that contains within it a depth of complexity that deserves more time than we will give it, but that demands acknowledgement. They were willing to fight for the country that had imprisoned their families. They did this not out of naivety. They were not naive. They had been living behind barbed wire. They knew perfectly well what was happening. But out of something that looks from one angle like loyalty, and from another like a strategic bet, and from a third angle like the expression of a specific, dignified refusal to be defined by the worst thing the government thought of them. Go for broke. That was the motto. It meant bet everything. It meant there is nothing to hold back because the holding back is already gone. The nursery is already sold. Your name has already been replaced by a number. The worst has already happened. So go for broke. The day George left Hart Mountain in his army uniform, Fumiko had ironed it in the communal laundry room at 5 in the morning, when no one else was there. Tak had polished his boots. Isamu had given him the wooden carving of a crane that he had been given by his own father in Hiroshima, and that he had carried across the Pacific and across California and into the camp. And that was the one object he had kept at all costs. He put it in George's breast pocket, over his heart. He did not say anything. He did not need to. George walked through the gate at Hart Mountain with a group of 15 other volunteers on a morning in March 1944. He was 18 years old. He turned and looked back at the camp, the tar paper barracks, the guard towers, the fence, and at his family standing at the gate. His grandfather with his hat in his hand in the cold, his mother standing very straight, his father with an expression George had never been able to name and would spend the rest of his life trying to find words for. He turned back and kept walking. He was a soldier of the United States Army going to fight for a democracy. His family was behind a fence inside that democracy. He walked. Italy was where they sent him. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team landed in Italy in the summer of 1944 and was attached to the 36th Infantry Division and fought its way up the Italian peninsula in the grinding, lethal, tactically impossible campaign that consumed men in the hills and ruins of a country that most of them had never heard of before the war. The terrain was vertical. The Germans were entrenched. The campaign moved in increments measured in yards and in casualties. The 442nd moved with it. George fought at Belvedere and at Louisiana and on the Gothic Line. He learned how to be afraid without stopping. He learned how to work in small groups through terrain that wanted to kill you, with men whose names had been replaced by numbers back home, and who had come here anyway. He fought beside men from Hawaii, Japanese Americans who had not been interned, because Hawaii's Japanese American population was 37% of the total, and the economy could not function without them, a fact that will become important shortly. And men from California, and men from Idaho, and men who had left their families at Manzanar and Topaz, and Heart Mountain and Grenada, and Minidoka, and Postun, and Gila River, and Jerome and Rower, all 10 camps, all 120,000 people behind wire, all still there while their sons were in Italy. The 442nd became the most decorated unit in United States military history for its size and length of service. 452 men were killed. Over 9,000 were wounded or injured. They received over 18,000 individual decorations, including 21 Medals of Honor, most of them upgraded decades later from Distinguished Service Crosses, after a review determined that racial discrimination had influenced the original medal decisions. There is a decorated unit. There is the unit's casualty rate. And there is the fact that while the unit was bleeding in Italy, the families who had produced the unit's soldiers were behind wire in Wyoming and California, and Utah, and Idaho, and Colorado, and Arkansas, imprisoned by the country the soldiers were dying for. The country did not find this ironic. The country found it logical. Daniel Inouye was 19 years old when he landed in Italy with the 442nd. He was a Nisei from Honolulu, Hawaii, not interned because Hawaii was Hawaii. And he was a sergeant by the time the 442nd reached the Gothic Line in April 1945. On April 21st, leading his platoon up a heavily defended ridge near San Terenzo, he destroyed 2 machine gun nests and was advancing on a third when a rifle grenade struck his right arm and exploded. His arm was nearly severed. He continued directing his men with the arm hanging. He threw a grenade with his left arm. He was eventually pulled back by his men and lost the arm in surgery. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, later upgraded to the Medal of Honor. He went on to serve in the United States Senate for 53 years, representing Hawaii. He was president pro tempore of the Senate. He was second in line of succession to the presidency. He had one arm. His other arm was in a ridge in Italy, left there in the service of a country that would not, even with that accounting on the table, say for another 4 decades that what it had done to his neighbors in California was wrong. George Shimoda came home in the fall of 1945 with a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star and a set of Italian phrases that made Fumiko laugh for the first time in 3 years. He came home to a camp that was in the process of closing, to parents he had not seen in 18 months, to a grandfather who had gotten thinner and quieter, and who held the crane carving when George returned it and turned it over in his hands for a long time without speaking. He came home to a country that was demobilizing its armies and throwing victory parades, and did not particularly want to examine at this moment the question of what it had done to the 120,000. He did not ask it to. He came home and he was quiet about it for a long time, the way men are quiet about things that are too large to say in the ordinary language of ordinary life. He would not be quiet about it forever. But first there was the work of returning, which turned out to be its own kind of war. Before any of that, there was Fred Korematsu. Fred Korematsu was 23 years old in 1942, a Nisei from Oakland, California, an American citizen, a welder who had been working in the shipyards in San Francisco Bay before Pearl Harbor, when his employer let him go on December 8, 1941, one day after the attack. He had tried to enlist after Pearl Harbor. He wanted to serve, and was rejected on medical grounds. He stayed in the Bay Area. He did not report when the evacuation notices went up. He altered his draft card, changed his name to Clyde Sarah, and continued living in Oakland with his Italian-American girlfriend, who was not being asked to evacuate. He was arrested on May 30th, 1942. His case went to trial in September 1942. He was convicted of violating a military exclusion order. The American Civil Liberties Union took his case on appeal. The question was constitutional. Could the government order the removal of American citizens from their homes based solely on their ancestry, with no individual hearing, no evidence of wrongdoing, no due process? Could race be the predicate for the suspension of constitutional rights? The Supreme Court of the United States heard Korematsu v. United States in October 1944. In December 1944, the court ruled 6-3 in favor of the government. Justice Hugo Black, writing for the majority, held that exclusion of citizens from their homes was constitutional in the context of military emergency, and that the court could not second-guess the military's judgment of what constituted a military necessity. He acknowledged that restricting the rights of citizens based on race was odious. He upheld it anyway. He said that odious things are sometimes necessary. He said that the court found no evidence that the military's judgment was wrong. He did not explain how the court would have found such evidence when the government had not produced any. Justice Frank Murphy dissented. Justice Robert Jackson dissented. Jackson's dissent contained a sentence that has circulated for 80 years because it is the most precise description of what the majority had done. A military order, he wrote, lies about, like a loaded weapon, ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need. Read that sentence with the weight it deserves. A loaded weapon, lying about, waiting for any authority that can claim urgency. Jackson was describing the majority's decision not just as wrong in the immediate case, but as dangerous in perpetuity. The decision established a precedent that could be picked up and used again by any government that could claim necessity, and necessity is always available to a government that wishes to claim it. The loaded weapon did not stay on the shelf. After September 11, 2001, it was invoked in surveillance programs, in detention policies, in travel restrictions. Korematsu was cited. The logic of military necessity over individual rights was available because the court had left it loaded, and governments know where the weapons are kept. Korematsu was not formally overturned until 2018, when the Supreme Court ruled in Trump v. Hawaii. Chief Justice John Roberts, writing for the majority in a case about travel bans targeting Muslim-majority countries, took the occasion to announce that Korematsu had been gravely wrong the day it was decided. This was 2018. The case it appeared in upheld the travel ban. The court condemned the weapon and fired it in the same opinion. But before we continue, the Hawaii exception. In December 1941, the Japanese military attacked Pearl Harbor. The attack was on Oahu, Hawaii. The casualties were at Pearl Harbor. The military bases were in Hawaii. The strategic concern was Hawaii. And the Japanese-American population of Hawaii in 1942 was approximately 158,000 people, 37% of Hawaii's total population. A mass internment of Hawaii's Japanese Americans would have been logistically impossible and economically catastrophic, since they constituted the backbone of the territory's labor force in agriculture, in construction, in the skilled trades, and in the military installations themselves. Hawaii's Japanese Americans were not mass interned. Military necessity was real enough to imprison 120,000 people in California. It evaporated in Hawaii, where it would have been expensive. Hawaii, where the bombs actually fell, where the military bases actually were, where the Japanese American population was 37%, too large and too economically essential to lock up. The same rationale that sent Fumiko Shimoda to a horse stall in California somehow reached a different conclusion in the territory where the attack had actually occurred. The difference was not the threat level. The difference was not the strategic calculation. The difference was the cost. In California, incarcerating the Japanese American population was cheap. Their labor was replaceable. Their farms and businesses could be had for $500. In Hawaii, it was too expensive. The military necessity argument held exactly as far as it was convenient, and stopped exactly where it became inconvenient. This one fact, is a complete refutation of every justification offered for internment. It does not require elaborate argument. It requires only the geography. The attack happened in Hawaii. The internment happened in California. In Hawaii, no mass internment. The military necessity was not in shorter supply in Hawaii. The Japanese Americans were not less Japanese in Hawaii. The difference was economic, which means the difference was never about security, which means 120,000 people were imprisoned for nothing that had anything to do with security. DeWitt's racial strains, FDR's signature, Jackson's loaded weapon. The Supreme Court of the United States called this constitutional in 1944. It took until 2018 to say otherwise. By then, most of the people inside the wire were dead. The camps began to close in 1945. Heart Mountain was officially closed on November 10, 1945. The internees were given train tickets and $25 and a bus to the nearest town, and told they were free to go. This is a sentence that requires a pause. They were given $25. After 3 years. After the nursery sold for $500. After the piano abandoned. After the dog given away. After Biscuit was dead by then, because 10 years and 3 years more will do it. After the truck sold, and the tools sold, and the lease signed over to Richards and the chrysanthemums left for the new owner to water, or not water, as he chose. After all of that, $25 and a bus ticket. The Shimodas went back to San Jose. The house was occupied. The people living in it had rented it from Richards, who had purchased the property for back taxes while they were at Heart Mountain. Richards had done nothing technically illegal. The legal structure of the situation, the mortgage that had continued accruing, the property tax that had continued accruing, the absence of any protection for interned owners, had produced a situation in which the people who had owned the property lost it by operation of the very legal system that had imprisoned them. The law took the house after the government took the freedom. It was efficient. They rented a room in Japantown, which had contracted significantly during the war years and would not recover its pre-war scale for a generation. Tak found work at a nursery in Milpitas, not his own, working for wages, which is where you start when you have $25 and a suitcase. Fumiko found work teaching at a school in San Jose that needed teachers, and that was less particular about who taught than it had been before the war, which was progress of a sort. Isamu sat in the room they rented and grew chrysanthemums in clay pots on the windowsill. The nursery was operating as the Hendricks Richards Nursery by 1946. Mabel Hendricks, who had paid Richards for her share of the operation after he acquired it, wasn't malicious about it. She was not a villain. She was a practical woman who had made practical calculations at a moment when the government had made practicality cheap. She had given Biscuit a good home. She was genuinely sorry, in an abstract way, that things had gone as they had. She sent a Christmas card to Fumiko in December 1945, and wrote that she hoped they were settling back in, and that if they ever wanted to stop by, she would love to see them. Fumiko did not stop by. She kept the card for decades, in a shoebox with the journal she had kept at Heart Mountain. Several hundred pages, small, careful handwriting, precise dates and observations. The record of what it was like to be an American who had been treated as an enemy by her own country. She kept the card and the journal together without annotation, which is its own kind of commentary. George came home decorated and enrolled at San Jose State College on the GI Bill. He studied engineering, as he had planned before the war, and he graduated in 1950 and got a job at a firm in San Jose and worked there for 32 years and retired in 1982. He married a Nice woman named Helen in 1952. He had 3 children, all American citizens, born in a California that was by then beginning, slowly, grudgingly, unevenly, to make room for them in a way it had not made room for their grandfather. He coached Little League on the same fields where he had played as a child, before the war, before the numbers, before Italy. He voted in every election. He told his children, when they were old enough, what had happened. He did not tell them in anger, at least not in the first years. He told them the way men tell things they are still organizing, still trying to fit into language that is large enough to hold them. The Japanese American community in San Jose rebuilt itself around absence. The people who came back found a neighborhood whose shape was familiar, but whose content had changed. The business is gone, the community organizations reconstituting, the relationships with white neighbors recalibrated in ways that were sometimes better and sometimes worse, and were always different. The pre-war world was not waiting for them. They were building the post-war world from whatever had survived. German Americans had not been mass interned. Italian Americans had not been mass interned. Some individuals from both groups had been arrested and held as suspected enemy agents. About 11,000 Germans and about 3,000 Italians underwent individual hearings or detention, but there was no order requiring every person of German or Italian ancestry to report to an assembly center, no tag around the neck, no horse stall, no guard tower pointing inward. The difference was not the threat level. German saboteurs had actually landed on American beaches in 1942. Italian-American men had relatives fighting in the Italian military on the other side. None of that produced a mass removal. The difference was the face. He was quiet about the camp for a long time. He was quiet about it until the Commission in 1980 was not quiet about it. It took 35 years for the government to ask what had happened. In 1980, the United States Congress established the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. The Commission was charged with reviewing the facts and circumstances of Executive Order 9066, the impact of the order on American citizens and permanent resident aliens, and the adequacy of the compensation that had been offered after the war, which was to say, the minuscule fraction of the losses that had been returned through a 1948 Claims Act that had compensated internees at 10 cents on the dollar for documented property losses, if they could document them, which many could not, because documentation requires records, and records require permanence, and permanence had been exactly what was taken from them. The Commission held hearings in 1981 in cities across the country. Survivors testified. Their children testified. The documents were reviewed. The military records were examined. The intelligence assessments from 1942 were declassified and reviewed, including the Ringel Report, a 1942 assessment by Naval Intelligence that had concluded that Japanese Americans posed no significant security threat and that mass internment was unnecessary, which is to say that the government had possessed an intelligence report at the time of the decision that said exactly what 40 years of subsequent history would confirm, and had ignored it, and had imprisoned 120,000 people anyway. The Commission's report, issued in 1983, was called Personal Justice Denied. Its central conclusion, the internment was not justified by military necessity, and the decisions that led to it were not driven by analysis of military conditions. The broad historical causes were race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Race prejudice, war hysteria, failure of political leadership. 3 ingredients, not exotic ingredients, not unusual ingredients. The question the Commission's report raises, obliquely, but it raises it, is whether those three ingredients are in shorter supply now than they were in 1942. Whether the architecture of the decision, the executive order, the military designation, the Supreme Court's deference, has been dismantled or merely left dormant. Whether Jackson's loaded weapon is less loaded now than it was then. The Commission recommended a formal apology and monetary compensation of $20,000 per surviving internee. Congress debated this for 5 years. In August 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. The act included a formal apology from the United States government to each surviving internee and authorized payment of $20,000 per survivor. The total paid was approximately $1.6 billion to 82,219 people. Tak Shimoda received his check in 1990. He was 83 years old. He sat at the kitchen table in the house he had been renting in San Jose since 1971. He and Fumiko had never again owned property. The mortgage felt too large, the risk of losing it again too present. And he held the check and the letter that accompanied it, which contained the government's apology. The letter was signed by the president. It said, in the language of official documents, that a grave injustice had been done. It said that the United States government was sorry. It said that the $20,000 was a token acknowledgement of the wrong. Tak read the letter twice. He set it on the table next to his coffee cup, which is what he set things next to when he was thinking about them. He looked out the window for a while. Fumiko asked him, "What are you thinking?" He said, "I'm thinking about the chrysanthemums." Isamu had died in 1959. Never a citizen, never compensated, never apologized to. In a rented room in San Jose with a clay pot of chrysanthemums on the windowsill and the wooden carving of a crane on the shelf beside his bed, and 34 years of California in his hands. He died as he had lived here, technically a foreigner, practically a man of this place, accorded neither the full belonging of the first nor the legal protection of the second. The check for $20,000 arrived 31 years after he died. The apology was 46 years late. Fumiko received her check and her letter separately. She sat with the journal she had kept at Heart Mountain and read parts of it, and then put it back in the shoebox and wrote one final entry, dated November 1990. The entry read, in full, "They said they were sorry. I believe they mean it. I don't know what to do with it. I'll try to think of something." She lived to be 91. She thought of something. She donated the journal to the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, where it was accessioned into the collection and cataloged and is available for researchers, and where it sits alongside thousands of other objects: the number tags, the photographs, the letters, the loyalty questionnaires with their damnable questions 27 and 28, the camp newspapers, the record of what was done and what was lost and what was not, finally, entirely gone, because she wrote it down. Fred Korematsu received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1998. President Clinton placed the medal around his neck at the White House. Korematsu was 78 years old. He had spent 56 years as a convicted felon. His 1942 conviction had never been vacated, technically, until a federal court vacated it in 1983 on a writ of coram nobis, finding that the government had suppressed and destroyed evidence favorable to Korematsu in the original proceedings. The government, it turned out, had known that its own intelligence agencies had found no basis for mass internment. It had suppressed those findings. It had sent 120,000 people to camps on evidence it had manufactured. And when the case reached the Supreme Court, it had withheld the evidence that would have undermined its own argument. A democracy did this, with paperwork. To its own citizens, the Supreme Court upheld it. It took 46 years to say sorry. Korematsu died in 2005. He had spent the last years of his life writing and speaking about the internment and about the danger of civil liberties abandoned in the name of security. After September 11, 2001, he filed amicus briefs in cases involving the detention of terrorism suspects, arguing that the logic of Korematsu, the logic of security over rights, of military necessity over due process, was being applied again. He argued this from personal experience. He had been a young man who refused to report. He had been convicted. He had watched the Supreme Court say his conviction was right. He had lived for 60 years knowing that the court had said he was wrong to resist. He was not wrong to resist. The court was wrong to say he was. Now consider the logic of General DeWitt one final time, because it deserves to be considered completely at the end, where its full shape is visible. DeWitt's position was as follows: Japanese Americans could not be trusted. The evidence for this was their ancestry. The fact that not one Japanese American had committed an act of sabotage or espionage was not exculpatory. It was, in DeWitt's formulation, itself suspicious, indicating that sabotage was being planned and that the absence of action meant only that the action was being delayed for strategic effect. Therefore, the absence of evidence of disloyalty was evidence of disloyalty. Therefore, every Japanese American was dangerous because none of them had been dangerous yet. Therefore, imprison them all. By this reasoning, and this is the reasoning that the government submitted and the Supreme Court accepted, every Japanese American was guilty because none of them were guilty. Their innocence was the indictment. Their clean record was the proof of their malice. It is perfect circular logic, sealed against refutation, immune to evidence, requiring only the initial premise, the racial premise, the undiluted racial strain, the enemy race, to produce any conclusion the government wished to reach. It is also the reasoning of a man who locked 120,000 people behind barbed wire and pointed guns at them and sold their nurseries for $500 and put their names in a number and asked their 69-year-old fathers to choose between statelessness and deportation, and who did all of this based on their faces, and who was never charged with anything, and who died in 1962, having been promoted to 4-star general in 1954. In 1944, the Supreme Court of the United States called this constitutional. In 2018, the same court called it gravely wrong. It was gravely wrong in 1944. It was gravely wrong the morning Takashimoto stood in his greenhouse and held a clay pot, and understood that his face had canceled his citizenship. It was gravely wrong when Fumiko set her suitcase down in a horse stall, and the smell of horses was the government's answer to her 30 years of paying taxes and teaching children and reading library books. It was gravely wrong when Isamu tied the number 27,841 to the button of his coat, with hands that did not entirely keep steady. It was gravely wrong when George walked through the gate at Hart Mountain in his uniform, and his grandfather held his hat and did not speak. It was gravely wrong every day that the guns on the towers pointed inward. It took 74 years to say so. By then, most of the people inside the wire were dead. The chrysanthemums, whoever planted them, bloomed anyway. They do not require permission. They do not require citizenship. They do not require that the country that grew them say it is sorry, though it is better when it does. They require only the work of planting, which Isamu Shimoda had always known how to do, which is what 30 years of building something beautiful in a country that would not call you its own finally comes to. Not the thing taken, but the knowledge in the hands. The knowledge that passes from old hands to young ones in the cold morning light of a greenhouse, before the papers come, before the notices appear on the telephone poles, before the numbers replace the names. The knowledge of how to make a living thing grow in difficult ground, which is the only knowledge that the government, for all its forms and orders and questionnaires and camps and gun towers pointing inward, was never able to confiscate. It tried. The chrysanthemums are still growing,